So, Lone Rider here. And the reason I'm all done up with the coat and a sweatshirt and a hat is I wanted to address the issue of climate. And this is something that's been a big political issue, well, going back about 20, 30 years, but maybe even more than that. But lately it's really taken on a life of its own, and it's become a very polarizing issue, and people are all up in arms. And you even see in France this past week, there were riots over fuel taxes that were supposedly prompted by efforts to combat climate change and so on and so forth. The cost of the taxes that would have attempted to curb the fuel use that was supposedly contributing to the greenhouse gases would have been arduous for the working people, and they were rioting as, I mean, understandably, you know, only so much money to spend on fuel, and there's only so far you can travel on foot or by bike. So if you have to drive certain places, and then it's like they're taking money from your pocket, they're taking the shirt off your back. It's no surprise that people would object to that. Now, that said, I don't condone the rioting and I don't condone the violence. I'm just pointing out that this is what happens when you have an unpopular policy. In the U.S., however, it's been very popular to talk about climate change. And it's gotten to the point where if you raise any questions about it, you're dismissed as if you're, one, some kind of wacko conspiracy theorist who should be wearing a tinfoil cap, or somebody who's being paid by, greedy oil companies. And I just wanted to lay out there why it is that some people might be skeptical of the whole global warming or anthropogenic, i.e. man-made, climate change narrative. And it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that regular people are a bunch of conspiracy nutters, or that they're being paid off to take a certain side by, let's say, ExxonMobil. The first thing is that the global warming people, or I should say anthropogenic climate change people, have overstated their case numerous times. And we can't necessarily attribute this to the scientists. We know, for example, with the IPCC panel, the UN organization that comes up with various assessments regarding this issue, that there's a scientific report and then there's a summary. The scientific report is written by the scientists. The summary is written by politicians and bureaucrats. And what oftentimes happens is the summaries actually misstate what's in the report, sometimes to the very real consternation of the scientists, some of whom have actually complained or even quit in protest. The average person sees that and says, right? I don't have any axe to grind on the issue one way or the other, but I'm looking at this and I'm seeing there's a contradiction there. If these summaries accurately represent what's in the report, why are people who actually wrote the report complaining that that's not what I said or that's not what I meant? Interesting, right? It raises questions among the regular person, the man in the street, the layman. It raises skepticism, and justifiably so. What happens is the report says one thing and the summary says something else. They may share things in common. There may be things that cross, but they're also two separate things sometimes. And I understand why this is. The politicians and the bureaucrats want to make sure they keep getting funding for the studies and this and that. And so they have to constantly make the case that there's some kind of impending emergency. That's logical and it makes sense, but it doesn't make for good science or a good basis for policy or for earning the trust of the general public. People are going to be skeptical when they see folks overstating the problem so much that it actually ticks off the people who wrote the actual report, just because they want to keep the issue current and front and center politically. You also have cases where, and again, this is on politicians, not necessarily scientists, but where you have well-known figures in the public view who make outlandish statements. All the ice will be gone by such and such a year. Al Gore was notorious for this. And then such and such a year rolls along, and surprise, some areas have lost ice, other areas have gained ice. We're basically okay. There's been no major change. And people are looking at this and they're like, wait. You predicted all of this bad stuff would happen and nothing's happened. Or something's happened, but it's so minor that it's like, it's not anywhere near what you were predicting, and it's something totally different. And there have been so many of these over-the-top disaster predictions that it's gotten to the point now where it's like the boy crying wolf in the old story. There's a lot of people who, when they hear a prediction now, the first thing they think of is all the predictions that never materialized, or that, only barely 1% of what was predicted materialized, and it didn't have the effect that people said it would. And they just kind of look at it and they're like, yeah, right, moving on to the next thing. So the overstatement of the problem, or the perceived problem, or the supposedly understood problem, is a big thing. And it has an effect. It makes people say to themselves, can I trust? Trust is a cumulative thing. It's built up over a lengthy period of time and over a series of repeated interactions. It can be destroyed in an instant by one mistake, or by one bad word, or by one act of ill faith. And maybe that's unfortunate. Maybe that's not ideal, but that's the way it is. People don't like folks who lie to them, or who exaggerate, or who overstate, or who say things that clearly don't happen, right? And it makes them skeptical of anything those people, or people with a similar view, then say in the future. The second thing is, there's been particular instances of manipulation of data or cover-ups. There were some emails that were hacked showing that scientists in East Anglia and England had apparently attempted to hide the decline in alleged warming. There was, for a period of several decades, there's been no overall increase in global temperature, which is coming at the same time as there's been this sort of pause in global warming. Everybody and their brother who is arguing for strict government measures and new government measures to combat it are saying that the issue is so urgent that we can't stop to consider the consequences of the supposed corrective measures. We just have to act. We have to do something now because it's so urgent. But yet, it's actually not that urgent, right? If there's been no overall warming in the last 20 years, maybe there was anthropogenic man-made climate change at some point, but not now. Or maybe it's still going on now, but it's now slowed to the point where it's negligible, or we can't measure it, or it's below the threshold, the margin of error, or our ability to study it. The point is that it's disingenuous to tell people we can't stop to have a debate, we have to act now because it's so urgent, but then the evidence shows it may not be urgent at all, or at least not nearly as much as you're showing. And then the fact that you would have people manipulating data to hide a decline in warming temperatures raises, then, like I said, when you have a person who exaggerates or lies or misstates, anything they say in the future, or like-minded people with the same agenda say in the future, is going to raise questions and skepticism on the part of people who say, well, but you said that before and it turned out you were lying. Yeah. So there's that. And you could say, well, it's just one isolated instance, but it's not. That's the problem. An isolated instance here, an isolated instance here, an isolated instance there. And pretty soon what you actually have is a trend, right? And the problem is that, well, most people, for example, won't condone the actual hacking that led to the release of the emails. Most people will be shocked and appalled by what those emails reveal if they reveal an infraction and a betrayal of the public trust that was as great as the hacking that led to them being released. And in this case, scientists who are supposedly out there to discover a universal truth, manipulating data because they wanted to show a certain thing, that is going to be a big it's going to have a big negative impact on how people view it. Same thing with the so-called hockey stick graph from Michael Mann and all of the things related to that. They couldn't duplicate the data. There were questions about picking and choosing, and well, what's going on with that? And of course, everybody then later said, well, let's just ignore the hockey stick graph and move on. The problem is, by making that statement, what you're ignoring is that the hockey stick graph at the time was presented as the best evidence for the case you're trying to make for anthropogenic global climate change. So when you say ignore that, you're saying ignore what at the time was put forward as the best evidence for the case you're trying to make. So if you ignore that and say move on, what are you moving on to? You're saying ignore the best case scenario that you put forward to make your case. What's left, right? And the very fact that there be these questions raised in and of themselves, a lot of times, if you have a genuinely sincere process and there's no shenanigans and there's no behind-the-scenes crap and there's no manipulation, which I understand in anything that's even slightly political is very hard to accomplish. But if you genuinely have people who are only interested in telling the truth and getting it out there and blah, 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 a lot of these things wouldn't even exist. So, a lot of people are looking at this, and the very fact that there are questions, whether you can explain away some of them or not, raise the issue of, can this narrative be trusted, right? And then you have the fact that there's a double standard in ascribing motives. People who question or not even question, but have questions about either the overall narrative or the specific proposals or what, how data was arrived at or promulgated or whatever. Anybody who asks any question, who isn't just mindlessly marching in lockstep with the prevailing order of the day, is instantly dismissed as, oh, you must be a shill for like ExxonMobil or something. What about all the scientists and the political appointees and the bureaucrats who are promoting the idea of man-made climate change and its allegedly disastrous effects and the therefore equally disastrous and potentially draconian proposals that must be put in place to combat it, according to that narrative? What about all of those people that actually work for the governments that would benefit from imposing these kind of rules and restrictions and so forth? People raise the question of, if you question it, is it because there's an ulterior motive, you're being paid off by people who have a horse in the game, essentially, a horse in the race? But nobody raises the issue of the people on the other side also have a horse in the race. You're only going to get funding if you make it look like there's a big issue to deal with. If you say, hey, it's no big deal, don't worry about it, it's normal, nobody's going to fund you. So overall, what do I think of this? I think there's legitimate questions we have to ask them.